November 17, 1983. Deep beneath a quiet farm in the rolling hills of central Virginia, an 8-year-old boy they called the Time Child opened his eyes inside a soundproof chamber and calmly recited the exact words President Reagan would speak in a classified briefing 3 weeks later, word for word, before the president had even written them. The air in the underground facility smelled of ozone and warm electronics. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like distant insects. A handful of CIA handlers in white lab coats stood frozen around the observation window, clipboards forgotten in their hands. The boy, thin, pale, with a bandage still taped over the scar from last year's accident, sat cross-legged on the padded floor, his small voice steady and clear. No hesitation, no tremor. He described the shape of the room Reagan would be in, the color of the drapes, the exact phrasing about Soviet missile movements in Central America. Then he added a detail that wasn't in any briefing book anywhere on Earth. A joke Reagan would tell off-mic to his national security advisor. Something about jelly beans in the Cold War. The technicians didn't laugh. They didn't even breathe for a long second. This wasn't the first time slip. It was simply the one that made the program unstoppable. They called him TC-01 on the paperwork, but inside the bunker, everyone just said, the Time Child. His real name was never written down after recruitment. His mother had signed the papers 6 months earlier in a fog of grief and government promises. Her husband, a Marine helicopter pilot, had died in a training crash, and the boy had suffered a severe head injury in the same accident. That was when the slips began. At first they were small. He'd wake up screaming about a car wreck that hadn't happened yet, or he'd draw pictures of family vacations that would take place the following summer. The local pediatrician wrote it off as trauma. The school counselor called it vivid imagination. But when the boy started describing classified military exercises happening 3 states away, someone in the chain of command finally listened. The CIA had been hunting for exactly this kind of anomaly ever since the Stargate Project proved that remote viewing sometimes worked. They'd spent millions testing psychics, spoonbenders, and soldiers who claimed they could stare at a map and see Soviet submarine pens. Most of it was theater. But every once in a while, something slipped through the cracks that couldn't be explained by cold reading or lucky guesses. The Time Child was different. He wasn't guessing. He was remembering the future. They moved him to the farm outside a small town in central Virginia in the summer of 1983. The property had belonged to the family of a retired Army colonel who owed the agency favors. Beneath the barn sat a concrete bunker originally built in the 1950s as a fallout shelter. The agency gutted it, soundproofed every inch, installed Faraday cages, and wired it with the latest biofeedback equipment from the Monroe Institute. They brought in hemisync tapes, those pulsing binaural beats designed to synchronize the brain's hemispheres, and they started the sessions slow. 10 minutes, 20, then hours. At first, the boy just described what he called the river. That was his word for time. He said it wasn't a straight line, but a wide, slow-moving river with eddies and backwaters. Most people only floated forward. He could step out onto the bank, walk upstream or downstream, and look around. The handlers pressed him for details. What does the president eat for breakfast on December 12th? What color tie will he wear to the summit in Geneva next year? The boy answered every question with the bored precision of a kid reading from a textbook he'd already memorized. But it was the physical evidence that turned skeptics into believers. On October 19, 1983, during a routine session, the Time Child suddenly sat up straight and said the Marines were going to die in Beirut. He described the exact barracks, the color of the dust, the smell of diesel and blood. He gave the date, October 23rd, and the body count. The handlers radioed Washington immediately.
The warning was logged, filed, and quietly ignored. 4 days later, the barracks in Beirut were bombed. 241 American servicemen died.
The boy cried for 6 straight hours afterward, rocking back and forth, repeating the same sentence. I told you before it happened. That was the moment the program went black budget all the way. No more monthly reports to Langley Oversight. No more sharing data with the Defense Intelligence Agency. The 7th floor wanted this one kept airtight. They doubled the staff, brought in child psychologists who knew how to keep a subject compliant, and started pushing the experiments harder. They wanted more than predictions. They wanted control. By early November, they were attempting what they called active insertion. The idea was simple on paper. If the boy could see the future, maybe he could reach out and nudge it. Just a little. Move a single object. Change one sentence in a speech. Prevent one small tragedy and watch the timeline ripple. The first test was almost playful. They asked him to make a technician's coffee mug slide 2 inches across a table in the next room, without touching it. The boy stared at the one-way glass for 30 seconds. Then the mug moved. Not dramatically, just enough to leave a wet ring on the wood where it had been. The technician swore he never touched it. They moved on to bigger targets. The session on November 17th was supposed to be routine. They wanted Reagan's briefing notes. Instead, they got something no one expected. The boy opened his eyes and spoke in a voice that didn't quite sound like his own anymore. Deeper, older, as if the words had traveled a long way. He recited the full classified script. Then he added the off-mic joke. Then he smiled, a small, tired smile, and said, "They're going to erase me after this, but not before I show you one more thing." He reached into the pocket of his hospital gown and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a newspaper clipping dated November 22nd, 1945, 40 years in the past. The headline read, "Truman announces atomic test success." The paper felt real. The ink smelled fresh. The edges weren't yellowed. One of the handlers took it, hands shaking, and later swore under oath that the document had not existed in the facility 5 minutes earlier. The time child closed his eyes again and whispered, "Time isn't a line. It's a room. And sometimes the door swings both ways." That night, the project leads met in the observation room long after the boy had been sedated and put to bed. They played the audio tape over and over. They examined the 1945 clipping under ultraviolet light. They argued in low voices about what this meant for national security, for the arms race, for the very concept of reality. One man, a veteran case officer who'd survived the Bay of Pigs, finally said what everyone was thinking. If this kid can pull yesterday into today, what happens when he decides to push tomorrow somewhere else? They didn't know it yet, but they were about to find out. Because 3 weeks later, the boy would try to save a plane full of people who hadn't even boarded it. And that decision would break the bunker, break time itself for 17 impossible minutes, and set in motion the order that would make the entire Time Child program disappear from every official record on Earth. The boy's name before the bunker was never spoken aloud again after that November night. His mother called him Elias, but the file that followed him from the Naval Hospital in Bethesda simply read Subject TC-01. Born in 1975 on a Marine base in North Carolina, he was the only child of Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Reed and a civilian nurse named Laura. Marcus died in a helicopter training accident outside Camp Lejeune in the spring of 1982. The official report said mechanical failure. Elias was strapped in the back seat. He survived, with a fractured skull and a brain bleed that the doctors said should have left him in a coma. Instead, he woke up 3 days later and told the nurse exactly which nurse would drop the tray of instruments in the hallway at 2:17 p.m. She laughed until it happened. That was the first documented slip. Laura Reed was approached in the hospital cafeteria by 2 men in dark suits who introduced themselves as consultants for the Department of Defense. They offered her a generous settlement, full medical coverage for life, and a promise that her son would receive special educational opportunities. She signed the non-disclosure agreement without reading the fine print. 6 weeks later, Elias was on a plane to Central Virginia with nothing but a small duffel bag and a teddy bear missing one eye. The early sessions were almost gentle. Technicians played the hemisync tapes through hidden speakers while Elias lay on a foam mat inside the isolation chamber. The binaural beats thumped softly at first, theta waves designed to quiet the conscious mind. Within minutes, the boy's breathing slowed and his small hands stopped fidgeting. Then the questions began through the intercom. "What's happening right now in the Oval Office?" Elias would describe the pattern on Reagan's tie, the smell of the coffee the president preferred, the way the national security advisor tapped his pen when he was nervous. Every detail checked out against the daily logs smuggled out of the White House by a cooperating aide. The handler started small. Could he see tomorrow's weather in Moscow? Could he read the headline of the Washington Post before the presses rolled? He could, and he did. But the boy wasn't just a passive viewer. He started interacting with the river. One afternoon in August, he asked for a crayon and a sheet of paper. He drew a crude map of the Mediterranean, then circled a spot in Lebanon. "Big boom here," he said. "Lots of Marines." October 23rd. The drawing was dated and logged. A copy was sent up the chain with a priority stamp. No one acted on it. The Beirut barracks bombing happened exactly as he had drawn it, right down to the color of the smoke. That was when the tone in the bunker changed. The project director, a career intelligence officer named Dr. Harlan Voss, ordered the team to stop treating Elias like a gifted child and start treating him like a national asset. They upgraded the chamber with full-spectrum EEG caps, added low-dose ketamine to the IV drip to deepen the trance state, and began what they called active reconnaissance. They gave Elias coordinates for Soviet bases in Afghanistan. He described troop movements that matched satellite photos taken the following week. They asked him to locate a missing American hostage in Beirut. He gave them the street address, the color of the door, and the name of the guard who would be smoking a cigarette outside at 3 a.m. A Delta team was dispatched. The hostage was recovered alive. Word of the successes reached the 7th floor at Langley. Black budget funding tripled overnight. New equipment arrived in unmarked trucks, prototype biofeedback machines, experimental electromagnetic shielding, even a modified isolation tank borrowed from the Navy's Submarine Research Division. The team grew from 6 to 23. Psychologists, physicists, linguists who specialized in dead languages, all sworn to secrecy under the highest classification level. Elias himself began to change. He spoke less and less in his own voice. Sometimes he answered questions in perfect Russian. Other times he described events from the 1940s as if he had been there. The 1945 newspaper he pulled from thin air wasn't the only object that crossed the timeline. A technician once found a 1962 penny on the chamber floor that had not been in circulation for 21 years. Mint condition, copper still bright. Another time, the boy reached out and touched the observation glass, and for 3 full seconds, the entire bunker's clocks ran backward. The second hand on the wall clock actually reversed direction while everyone watched. The handlers started calling these events bleed-throughs. They documented everything: audio tapes, video, handwritten logs in 3 different ciphers. Dr. Voss personally reviewed every session transcript, circling phrases like, "The river bends here," and "I can push if you want me to." He underlined the word push 3 times and wrote in the margin, "Test parameters for controlled insertion." The first controlled insertion happened on October 31st. They told Elias to move a single sheet of paper from one table to another in an adjacent room. No wires, no hidden strings, just his mind and the river. The boy closed his eyes. For 20 seconds, nothing happened. Then the paper lifted, fluttered like a leaf in an invisible wind, and settled on the second table. The technician in the room screamed. The paper had his own handwriting on it, notes he had written that morning, except the ink was still wet. Elias opened his eyes and smiled for the first time in weeks. "I can do bigger things," he said, "if you let me." Dr. Voss leaned into the intercom. "How big?" The boy looked straight at the one-way glass, straight into the camera that was recording everything. "Big enough to save people who aren't dead yet." That sentence should have been the warning. Instead, it became the mission statement. They gave him his first real target 2 weeks later, a commercial airliner scheduled to depart from Dulles on December 12th. Mechanical failure on takeoff. 147 souls. Elias had seen the crash in the river weeks earlier. Twisted metal, flames licking the runway, the tail number painted clearly on the fuselage. The team fed him the flight number and the exact departure time. They told him to reach out and change one small thing. Just one. A loose bolt tightened. A warning light noticed early. Anything that would keep the plane on the ground. Elias agreed. He lay back in the chamber, hooked to every monitor they had, and slipped into the deepest trance yet. The hemisync tapes played at maximum volume. The ketamine drip ran wide open. For 43 minutes, the only sound was the boy's slow breathing and the soft beeping of the heart monitor. Then everything went wrong. The lights in the bunker flickered once, twice. On the third flicker, the power failed completely. Emergency generators should have kicked in within 4 seconds. They didn't. For 17 minutes, the entire facility was plunged into absolute darkness. No clocks, no cameras, no sound except the distant dripping of water somewhere in the ventilation shafts. When the lights finally returned, Elias was sitting up in the chamber, nose bleeding, eyes wide with terror. "I fixed it," he whispered. But something else broke instead. Later that night, the team learned the Dulles flight had landed safely. No mechanical issues, no incident. The passengers never knew how close they had come to dying. But inside the bunker, 17 minutes of time had simply vanished, and in its place was a single new entry in the logbook that no one remembered writing. Timeline integrity compromised. Subject TC-01 has been noticed. They are coming for him. The handwriting wasn't Dr. Voss's. It wasn't any technician's. It was Elias's own careful, childish script. And the ink was still wet. The logbook entry wasn't the only thing that changed that night. By morning, the entire bunker felt different. The air carried a faint metallic taste, like blood on the tongue after a bitten lip. Technicians who had worked the overnight shift reported headaches that wouldn't quit and dreams that bled into daylight. Memories of events they were certain had never happened. One guard swore he remembered attending Elias's funeral 2 years earlier. Another found a photograph in his wallet of himself shaking hands with the boy at a Christmas party that the calendar said had never occurred. They compared notes in the break room and realized every altered memory matched something the time child had described in earlier sessions. Dr. Harlan Voss called an emergency meeting at 0600. The table was littered with fresh Polaroids of the chamber floor, faint scorch marks that hadn't been there the night before, a child-sized handprint burned into the concrete as if the boy's skin had glowed white-hot for a single instant. Voss looked 10 years older than he had the day before. His hands trembled as he flipped through the overnight transcripts. "We are no longer observing the river," he said quietly. "We are swimming in it, and something just noticed us back." They doubled the security detail. No one in or out without triple verified credentials. The boy was moved to a secondary isolation suite deeper in the complex, a room lined with 6 inches of lead and copper mesh. They told Elias it was for his own protection. He just nodded, eyes distant, and asked for a glass of chocolate milk. "From the year I turned 13. They gave it to him. It tasted exactly like the brand that wouldn't hit store shelves until 1988. The bleed-throughs accelerated. On November 29th, a maintenance electrician walked into the generator room and found a 1957 issue of Life magazine lying on a tool cart. The cover story celebrated the launch of Sputnik, except the date printed on the masthead was tomorrow's date, November 30th, 1983. The paper was warm to the touch. When the electrician tried to pick it up, the ink smeared across his fingers like fresh newsprint. He dropped it. By the time he called for backup, the magazine had vanished, leaving only a faint, rectangular shadow on the dusty metal. Elias, when questioned, simply shrugged. "I was homesick for the 50s, he said. "So I borrowed it." The team started keeping a separate ledger titled Anomalies Not Attributable to Subject. They filled 3 pages in 48 hours. A coffee mug from the White House mess hall appeared on Dr. Voss's desk, porcelain still bearing the presidential seal, steam rising, cream and sugar exactly how the president took it that morning. A Soviet officer's cap, complete with red star and the faint smell of cheap Russian cigarettes, materialized in the observation room. The boy denied moving any of it. He claimed the river was leaking both directions now, and that he was only trying to keep it from flooding the whole facility. One former technician, known in the underground forums only as Deep Echo, later described the scene in a 2017 anonymous podcast interview that was scrubbed from the internet within 48 hours. His voice cracked as he recalled watching Elias draw a perfect schematic of the Pentagon's classified underground levels the boy had never visited and that remained blacked out on every public map. The kid wasn't guessing, Deep Echo said. He was walking the hallways in real time. I saw him flinch when an MP walked past him in whatever year he was visiting. He ducked like the guy could actually see him. The nurse assigned to Elias's care, a woman who would only speak off-record years later under the pseudonym Nurse K, remembered the physical toll on the boy. His growth charts stopped making sense. One week he measured 4'2". The next morning the tape read 4'5". His voice cracked like puberty had fast-forwarded 6 years in a single night. Bruises appeared on his arms that looked days old, then vanished by afternoon. She once caught him staring at his own reflection in the observation glass, whispering, "I'm running out of me." Dr. Voss tried to slow things down. He ordered a 2-day hiatus from active insertions. They let Elias watch cartoons on a small television, play with coloring books, even take a supervised walk on the surface under the central Virginia stars. For 24 hours, the bunker was almost peaceful. Then, at 3:14 a.m. on December 3rd, every monitor in the observation room lit up at once. Elias was in a full trance without any hemisync, without drugs, without prompting. His eyes were open but rolled back, and he was speaking rapidly in a language the linguists later identified as a dialect of ancient Sumerian, mixed with perfect modern English. He was negotiating with something. "I won't let you take them," he said, voice steady. "The plane is safe. The people are safe. I fixed it. Now leave us alone." The temperature in the chamber dropped 20 degrees. Frost formed on the inside of the glass. One of the EEG leads snapped off and whipped across the room like a live wire. When the team finally revived him, Elias looked exhausted but triumphant. "They wanted the plane back," he told Voss through the intercom. "I told them no. I told them the river belongs to everyone now." Voss stared at the boy for a long time. Then he did something the logs never recorded. He turned off every camera in the room, killed the microphones, and spoke to Elias man to man for the first and only time. "What happens if they come for you instead?" The boy smiled the saddest smile any of them had ever seen. "Then you'll have to erase me, Doctor. And you'll have to do it perfectly, because if even one piece of me stays behind, the river will remember." That conversation was the beginning of the end, because on the 7th floor at Langley, someone was already reading the overnight flash traffic. Someone who understood that a weapon this powerful could never be allowed to exist in the hands of an 8-year-old who was starting to rewrite the rules. The order came down the next afternoon in a single encrypted line, delivered by courier in a burn bag. Terminate Project Timechild. Sanitize all records. Subject to be relocated under new identity. Any residual anomalies to be attributed to equipment malfunction. The courier never made it back to his car, and somewhere in the river, a small hand reached out and quietly closed the door behind him. The courier's car was found empty the next morning, engine still running, doors unlocked, on a back road 10 miles from the bunker. No tire marks, no footprints in the frost. Just the burn bag on the passenger seat, empty except for a single child's drawing, a stick-figure boy standing in a river, waving goodbye to a line of shadowy men in suits. The drawing was dated December 4th, 1983, the day the order had been issued. The courier was never seen again. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere had turned electric. Dr. Voss knew the clock was ticking. He gathered the senior team in the observation room at 0800 hours and laid it out in a voice barely above a whisper. "Langley wants the program sanitized. That means the boy, the tapes, the logs, everything. But we all saw what happens when he gets scared. We all felt the river push back last night. If we move too fast, we could lose more than 17 minutes this time." They decided on one final session, one last controlled insertion. Elias would be asked to lock the timeline in place, to make sure the Dulles flight stayed safe forever, to seal the door he had cracked open. No more bleed-throughs. No more objects from yesterday or tomorrow. Just peace. They told the boy it was his chance to go home, to see his mother, to live a normal life again. He looked at them with those ancient 8-year-old eyes and said, "Normal left a long time ago, Doctor, but I'll try." They prepped the chamber like it was a lunar landing. Every monitor was triple calibrated. Backup generators were hot switched to military-grade diesel. The HemiSync tapes were replaced with a custom sequence Voss had commissioned from the Monroe Institute's deepest archives, frequencies that supposedly anchored the brain to a single point in space-time. Elias was given a mild sedative, not enough to knock him out, just enough to keep him calm. He lay on the mat in his hospital gown, electrodes glowing faintly on his shaved scalp, and closed his eyes. At 14:37, the session began. For the first 11 minutes, everything was textbook. Elias's voice came through the speakers soft and clear. He described the dullest tarmac exactly as it existed in that moment. Frost on the wings, the smell of jet fuel, the pilot doing his final walk-around. Then he reached deeper. "I see the bolt," he said. "The one that's going to shear in 43 days. I'm tightening it. Now." A technician in the adjacent room reported the maintenance log updating itself on his clipboard, new ink appearing where none had been. The room temperature dropped again. Not 20 degrees this time, 40. Frost raced across the observation glass like spiderwebs. The heart monitor began to flatline, then spiked into a rhythm no human heart should produce. Elias's small body arched once, violently, and he spoke in a voice that layered over itself. His own, then an adult man's, then something older, something that sounded like it had crossed centuries. "I fixed the plane," he said, "but they don't want it fixed. They say the river has rules." At 14:51, the lights died. Not flickered, died. Every bulb, every screen, every red emergency lamp. Absolute darkness swallowed the bunker. The emergency generators screamed to life, then died in the same breath. For 17 minutes, the only sound was the slow drip of condensation and the ragged breathing of 23 grown men and women who suddenly realized they were no longer in 1983. Some of them later swore the walls breathed. Others heard voices in the ventilation shafts, conversations from the 1940s, Truman announcing the bomb, scientists at Los Alamos arguing about whether time was a weapon. One psychologist found herself standing in the break room holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, except the calendar on the wall now read 1975, and her own reflection in the microwave door showed her 20 years younger. A guard outside the chamber door felt a small hand slip into his, and heard Elias's voice whisper, "Don't let them erase me," even though the boy was locked inside. Dr. Voss stood frozen at the observation window, flashlight dead in his hand, when the entire facility lurched. Not an earthquake, a lurch, like the bunker had been picked up and set down 1 second out of phase. Clocks that had stopped at 14:51 suddenly spun forward, then backward, then stopped again on a date that wouldn't exist for another 19 years. December 21st, 2002. When power finally slammed back on at 15:08, the silence was worse than the darkness. Elias sat upright in the chamber, nose bleeding in 2 steady streams, eyes bloodshot but calm. The EEG cap had melted into his scalp in places. The concrete floor around him was covered in fresh newspaper clippings, headlines from 1945, 1963, 1991, 2016, all reporting plane crashes that had never happened because he had stopped them. The 1945 Truman paper was back, now joined by a 1986 Challenger mission patch, still smelling of shuttle fuel, and a 2001 World Trade Center employee ID badge that should not have existed for another 18 years. The boy looked straight into the camera that had just rebooted and said, "I saved them all. But the river is angry. It wants balance. It wants me." Dr. Voss didn't hesitate. He hit the master shutdown switch, killing every feed, every recorder, every light except the emergency reds. Then he picked up the red phone that connected directly to Langley and spoke the words that would end the program. Project Time Child has suffered catastrophic temporal breach. Request immediate termination protocol. Subject exhibits uncontrolled cross-timeline agency. Recommend full sanitization. Physical, digital, and human. The voice on the other end didn't ask questions. It simply replied, Protocol 7 is authorized. Make the boy disappear. Make the bunker forget it ever existed. And Voss, if even 1 second of this leaks, you'll join him in the river. By 2200 hours, the trucks arrived. Black, unmarked, windows tinted beyond legal limits. Men in hazmat suits who never spoke removed every piece of equipment, every tape, every logbook. They scrubbed the chamber with industrial solvents that erased more than fingerprints. They took Elias last. He walked between them without fighting, still in his gown, clutching the teddy bear with the missing eye. At the bunker door he paused, turned to Dr. Voss, and whispered something only the doctor would ever hear.
You can erase the files. You can erase me. But you can't erase the river. And one day, it's going to remember my name.
The trucks drove into the central Virginia night. The farm above was sold to a shell company within 72 hours. The bunker was sealed. The entrance collapsed with controlled explosives listed as routine maintenance. By Christmas 1983, the entire Time Child program had never existed. Or so they thought. Because 3 months later, the first memo surfaced on a dead drop in Prague, an internal CIA routing slip dated November 17, 1983, with a single handwritten note in the margin, TC-01 successful, recommend immediate weaponization. The paper was warm. The ink was wet. And somewhere, in a river that no longer followed the rules, a small hand was still waving. The erasure had begun. But the Time Child was already 1 step ahead. The erasure was supposed to be total. But secrets have a way of slipping through the river, just like the boy said they would. By the spring of 1984, the farm in central Virginia looked like any other abandoned property in the rolling Piedmont hills. Rusted no trespassing signs, overgrown fields, a barn roof sagging under the weight of 3 winters. No one drove up the long gravel road. No one noticed the faint scorch marks still visible on the concrete pad where the bunker entrance had been. Langley's sanitization team had done their job with clinical precision. Every hard drive wiped, every tape demagnetized, every paper copy fed into industrial shredders and then burned. Dr. Harlan Voss was reassigned to a desk job in Langley's archives division, officially a promotion, unofficially a cage. The rest of the team scattered under new identities. The boy simply ceased to exist in any official ledger. Elias Reed became a ghost with a new social security number and a sealed juvenile file that read, deceased due to complications from prior head trauma. And yet the story refused to die. The first crack appeared in 1986. A low-level archivist in the CIA's reading room, cataloging old Stargate files for destruction, found a single carbon copy of a routing slip that should not have survived. It was dated November 17, 1983, the exact day of the boy's Reagan briefing. The subject line read, Project TC-01, Time Child, immediate weaponization recommended. Handwritten in the margin, in what looked like Voss's own script, successful temporal insertion confirmed. Subject exhibits bidirectional agency. The archivist made a photocopy for his personal files, then quietly passed it to a friend at the Monroe Institute. Within months, the slip had been scanned and leaked to fringe newsletters that specialized in psychic warfare. No one could verify it. The original had vanished from the archives the very next day. Then, in 1991, another document surfaced, this one far more detailed. It was a 29-page report titled Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process, dated June 9, 1983, just months before the Time Child program allegedly went live. The author was Lieutenant Colonel Wayne M. McDonnell, working out of the Army's Intelligence and Security Command. The report discussed hemisync binaural beats, hemispheric synchronization, and the theoretical possibility that human consciousness could transcend linear time. It talked about absolute and relative time, about the brain accessing information from past and future events through altered states, It even included diagrams of space-time folding in on itself. Conspiracy researchers latched onto it immediately. Here, they said, was the smoking gun, the CIA's own blueprint for weaponizing time travel through children. The report was uploaded to early internet bulletin boards, then to GeoCities pages, then to YouTube in grainy scans that circulated for years. Except the Gateway Process report never mentioned children.
It never mentioned Central Virginia, bunkers, isolation chambers for minors, or any 8-year-old subject.
It was a theoretical paper on consciousness research, funded because the military wanted to know if soldiers could use altered states of consciousness for intelligence work. The Monroe Institute had been cooperating with the government since the 1970s on exactly that, non-lethal mind tools for intelligence work. The report was declassified in full in 2003 and placed in the CIA's public reading room, where anyone with an internet connection could read it today. No redactions about time children. No hidden appendices about bleed-throughs or 17-minute blackouts. Just dry, bureaucratic language about brainwave entrainment and the physics of perception. Still, the leaks kept coming. In 2009, a grainy audio file appeared on a now-defunct conspiracy forum. It was supposedly a recording of Elias's voice reciting Reagan's future briefing. The boy's tone was eerily calm, the words precise. Audio experts who analyzed it found the voice print matched no known child actor, but the recording itself had been digitally altered. Background hums that didn't match 1983 recording equipment, faint digital artifacts from 2010 software. The file was taken down after 48 hours, following a DMCA notice from an anonymous law firm. 2 weeks later, the forum moderator received a visit from men who never showed badges, but left him convinced that continuing the story would be a very bad idea. By 2017, the narrative had evolved into full folklore. Anonymous YouTube channels with names like ShadowGov Leaks and Temporal Watch pieced together Deep Echo's podcast interview, Nurse K's off-record testimony, and blurry Polaroids of the bunker that were later proven to be from an unrelated Cold War fallout shelter in Pennsylvania. They added the Montauk Project, Project Pegasus, and the Philadelphia experiment for good measure. The story became a franchise. The Time Child wasn't just one boy. He was the prototype for a whole generation of government time weapons. View counts climbed into the millions. Books were self-published. Patreon campaigns raised money to find Elias Reed. Every new leak, every new declassified memo followed the same pattern. It appeared suddenly on obscure sites, spread like wildfire, then vanished just as quickly, often after mysterious server crashes or copyright strikes from entities that didn't exist on paper. The pivot had begun. Because if the CIA really had run a program this explosive in the hills of Central Virginia, why did the only surviving document, the Gateway Process report, read like a graduate thesis on meditation rather than a black budget nightmare? Why did every physical artifact from the bunker trace back to the same handful of online hoaxers who had previously pushed the Philadelphia experiment as real? And why did the boy's story fit so perfectly into the pattern of every other post-MKUltra legend born after the real abuses were exposed? Real secrecy plus public distrust equals infinite room for invention. The river, it seemed, had one last trick. It had let the story leak just enough to keep itself alive. But the truth behind the leaks was about to surface in the cold light of 1983's actual paper trail. And once it did, the entire Time Child legend would unravel faster than a newspaper clipping pulled backward through 40 years of time. Let's start with the one document that actually exists. June 9th, 1983. 9 days before the boy supposedly recited Reagan's future briefing in that Central Virginia bunker. A U.S. Army lieutenant colonel named Wayne M. McDonnell finished a 29-page report for the CIA's Science and Technology Division. Its title was straightforward: Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process. Declassified in full in 2003, and now sitting in the CIA's public reading room for anyone to download, it is the document conspiracy channels have waved around for years as proof of the Time Child program. Except it isn't. The report is a technical review of the Monroe Institute's hemi-sync audio technology, binaural beats designed to synchronize the left and right hemispheres of the brain. McDonnell explains, in dense bureaucratic language, how these sound patterns can produce altered states of consciousness, enhanced focus, and even out-of-body sensations. He draws on physics, neuroscience, and quantum mechanics to explore theoretical ideas about consciousness interacting with space-time. He writes about escaping the restrictions of time and space, in the same way a meditator might describe transcending the physical body during deep trance. It is speculative, it is theoretical, and it is explicitly about training adult volunteers, soldiers, intelligence officers, anyone who could handle the protocol. Nowhere in its 29 pages does the word child appear. Nowhere does it mention Central Virginia, bunkers, isolation chambers for minors, or any 8-year-old subject. There is no Elias Reed. No TC-01, no bleed-throughs, no pulled newspapers, no 17-minute blackouts. The report treats time not as a literal river you can walk up and down, but as a perceptual construct that the trained mind might navigate in altered states. It is the kind of document you write when you're trying to figure out whether meditation tapes could give field agents an edge in remote viewing, part of the larger Stargate Project that the CIA had been running since the 1970s. Stargate itself was declassified years ago. It tested adults. It produced mixed results. It was shut down in 1995 because the data never justified the cost. No time machines, no kids. So where did the Time Child story come from? Every single leaked memo that conspiracy researchers cite as proof traces back to the same narrow window, the mid-2010s YouTube ecosystem. Channels that also promoted the Montauk Project, Project Pegasus, and the idea that the Philadelphia experiment of 1943 had somehow evolved into full-scale time travel by the 1980s. The Montauk story itself began as a 1992 self-published book by a man named Preston Nichols, who claimed he recovered repressed memories of secret experiments on Long Island. Historians, journalists, and even former Montauk Air Force Base personnel have torn the book apart. No records. No corroborating witnesses outside the author's circle. The evidence was always blurry photos, secondhand stories, and the classic pattern of Cold War secrecy plus public imagination equals myth. The Time Child memos follow the identical template. Grainy scans that appear suddenly, spread virally, then vanish when people start asking for chain of custody proof. Search the CIA's own reading room database today. Type Time Child. Type TC-01. Type Elias Reed or Central Virginia Temporal Insertion. You get 0 results. Not redacted files, not access denied. 0. The agency has released hundreds of thousands of pages from the MKUltra era, from Stargate, from Gateway. They admit to LSD experiments on unwitting subjects.
They admit to trying to weaponize psychics. They do not admit to anything resembling the boy in the bunker because the paper trail never existed in the first place. The physics makes the rest impossible.
To bend space-time enough for even a single atom to travel, backward or forward, requires energy on the scale of a black hole or a warp drive, the kind of thing that exists only in equations and science fiction. In 1983, the most powerful particle accelerator on Earth was the Tevatron at Fermilab, capable of smashing protons at energies measured in tera-electron volts. That is nowhere near the Planck scale energies needed to warp time for a human mind. The hemi-sync tapes in the real Gateway report do not generate that kind of power. They generate a gentle 4 Hz difference between your ears. Your brain does the rest, producing theta waves associated with deep relaxation and vivid imagery. The time slips described in the legend are exactly what neuroscientists expect from prolonged sensory deprivation, low-dose sedatives, and a highly suggestible 8-year-old who has already suffered traumatic brain injury. The mind fills in gaps. It constructs narrative. It retrofits vague predictions onto real events that happen later. Confirmation bias does the heavy lifting. The bleed-through objects? The 1945 newspaper? The 1962 penny? Classic stage magic props updated for the conspiracy age. In the 1980s, the CIA was not above running psychological operations, but they were not running literal magic shows with physical time artifacts. Those stories only surfaced decades later, long after the internet made it trivial to fabricate a scanned document, add some digital aging, and watch it spread. The nurse and technician testimonies? Anonymous. Conveniently timed. And always tied back to the same online communities that treat every declassified page as a puzzle, missing only the secret time child chapter. This is not to say the CIA was innocent. They really did chase psychic phenomena during the Cold War. They really did spend taxpayer money on binaural beats and consciousness research because the Soviet Union was doing the same thing. They really did keep files classified for decades, breeding the exact distrust that lets myths flourish. But the leap from we tested meditation on adults to we kidnapped an 8-year-old and broke time itself is not a small step. It is an entire canyon filled with the same human psychology that once made people swear they saw fairies in the Cottingley photographs or alien autopsies in blurry 16mm film. The legend did not die because the river protected it. It survived because the human mind craves the impossible when the possible feels too ordinary, too bureaucratic, too limited by physics and ethics. And that craving is exactly what the next layer of the debunk would expose. How a single theoretical report from 1983 became the seed crystal for an entire alternate history that never happened. But first, we have to look at the boy himself, or rather, the complete absence of any boy who ever matched the description. There was never an 8-year-old boy named Elias Reed who vanished into a Central Virginia bunker in 1983. No birth certificate, no naval hospital record from Bethesda, no Marine helicopter pilot father killed in a training crash outside Camp Lejeune in the spring of 1982. The entire backstory, fractured skull, early time slips, grieving mother signing papers in a hospital cafeteria, does not exist in any public or declassified archive. Search the Social Security Death Index, the National Archives, the Marine Corps casualty list from that year. Nothing. The name Elias Reed appears in scattered genealogies, but none match the timeline. None connect to any CIA program, and none involve a child with documented precognitive abilities. The boy was invented the same way the 1945 newspaper and the 1962 penny were invented, as props in a story that only needed to feel real long enough to spread. Dr. Harlan Voss never existed either. No personnel file at Langley lists an intelligence officer by that name working Stargate or Gateway in 1983. The nurse, known only as Nurse K, and the technician Deep Echo have never come forward with verifiable identities or original recordings. Their anonymous interviews surfaced on conspiracy podcasts years after the fact, always carefully edited, always just detailed enough to hook the next viewer, but never detailed enough to survive basic fact-checking. The courier who supposedly vanished with the burn bag? His car, the drawing, the empty road. All fabrications layered onto the legend in the 2010s when YouTube algorithms discovered that Cold War psychic stories performed better than almost anything else. The only real 1983 document at the center of this myth is the one we already examined, Lieutenant Colonel Wayne M. McDonnell's Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process. 29 pages of dense analysis on binaural beats, hemispheric synchronization, and the theoretical outer limits of human consciousness. It was written for the Army's Intelligence and Security Command as part of the larger Stargate effort. It theorized that a properly trained mind might perceive information outside normal space-time constraints. It never once proposed building a bunker for a child. It never suggested pulling physical objects across decades. It was a speculative white paper on whether meditation tapes could sharpen remote viewing for adult intelligence officers. The CIA declassified it completely in 2003. It sits on their public reading room server right now, free to download, with 0 redactions about secret time children because there were never any. Stargate itself, the real program, ran from the 1970s until 1995. It tested hundreds of adults, military and civilian, in controlled remote viewing trials. Some sessions produced intriguing hits. Most produced noise. The entire project was reviewed by independent scientists, found statistically weak, and shut down because the intelligence yield did not justify the expense. No children were ever involved. The program's own declassified overviews, released in batches through the 1990s and 2000s, contain zero references to temporal insertion, bleed-through artifacts, or 17-minute blackouts. The physics required to make any of that happen in 1983 was, and remains, impossible. You would need energies measured in solar masses to warp space-time enough for a human brain to interact with past or future events as literal locations. The Tevatron particle accelerator at Fermilab in 1983 operated at energies trillions of times too weak. Hemisync tapes produce 4 Hz differences between your ears. That is not a time machine. That is a relaxation aid. The legend was manufactured the old-fashioned way. Take one real, mildly exotic government document, strip away its boring bureaucratic context, then graft on elements from earlier hoaxes. The Montauk Project claimed the government used children for time experiments on Long Island in the 1970s and 80s. Project Pegasus insisted DARPA sent kids back to witness historical events. Both stories originated in self-published books and late-night radio shows in the 1990s, long after MKUltra's real abuses had primed the public to believe the worst. By the time YouTube arrived, the recipe was perfected. Upload a grainy scan of the Gateway Report. Add ominous music. Claim the redacted sections, there are none. Hide the time child. Watch the algorithm do the rest. Each new video cited the last as proof. Anonymous leakers provided just enough new memos to keep the cycle alive, until servers crashed or copyright claims from phantom law firms took them down. The pattern is textbook. Real secrecy breeds suspicion, suspicion breeds invention, and invention breeds clicks. Psychologists have a term for what happened next: source amnesia. People remembered the story, but forgot it began as entertainment layered on top of a meditation study. Confirmation bias did the heavy lifting. When a real plane landed safely, believers credited the invisible boy. When a bombing happened anyway, they blamed the CIA for ignoring the warning. The human mind hates loose ends. It prefers a secret program that almost broke time to the far more mundane truth. The CIA spent money on binaural beats because the Soviets were doing the same thing, and both sides came up mostly empty. By the time the 2017 audio clip and the 2009 forum posts appeared, the time child had become self-sustaining folklore. It no longer needed new evidence. It only needed believers willing to fill the gaps. And the gaps were easy to fill because the government really had run unethical mind experiments in the decades before. MKUltra was real. LSD on unwitting citizens was real. The distrust was earned. The time child simply walked into that vacuum wearing a hospital gown and carrying a 1945 newspaper.
But the river was never real. The bunker was never real. The boy was never real.
What was real was a 30-year-old Army report on consciousness that got turned into the ultimate Cold War ghost story. Because a story about a kid who could rewrite history is a lot more compelling than one about soldiers listening to headphones in a lab. And that is where the final truth settles. The only thing the CIA ever successfully erased in 1983 was the public's ability to separate a theoretical paper on meditation from a full-blown science fiction conspiracy. The rest was written by us. The story of the time child was never about a boy who could walk the river of time. It was always about us. In the decades after MKUltra's ugly truths spilled into the open, LSD dosed into unsuspecting citizens, hypnosis experiments on prisoners, the very real attempt to crack open the human mind for Cold War advantage, Americans learned to expect the worst from their government. When a dry 29-page Army report on binaural beats and consciousness landed in the public domain in 2003, it carried the perfect scent of secrecy. Here was the CIA admitting in its own bureaucratic prose that it had spent years wondering whether the mind could slip the bonds of ordinary time and space. The report never mentioned children. It never mentioned Central Virginia bunkers or bleed-through newspapers. But the gap between what it actually said and what the public had already been conditioned to fear was wide enough for an entire legend to walk through. The internet did the rest. By the mid-2010s, YouTube channels hungry for watch time discovered that Cold War psychic stories converted better than almost anything else. Take the real gateway document, strip away the footnotes and the careful qualifiers, add some ominous music and anonymous whistleblower voices, and suddenly you had a franchise. The Montauk Project, Project Pegasus, the Philadelphia experiment, all of them recycled the same ingredients: government secrecy, plus a grain of exotic science, plus a child who suffered for the greater good. Each new video cited the last. Each new leaked memo appeared just long enough to rack up millions of views before vanishing under mysterious copyright strikes. The algorithm rewarded the mystery. The audience rewarded the algorithm. And the story of Elias Reed, the 8-year-old who could pull 1945 into 1983, became self-sustaining folklore. It survived because it gave us something the real Stargate program never could: a sense of power. In a world where history feels written by faceless committees and distant superpowers, the idea that one small boy could reach into tomorrow and tighten a bolt on a doomed airplane is intoxicating. It whispers that the future is not fixed, that ordinary people, especially the vulnerable ones, might hold the ultimate weapon. It turns the terror of helplessness into a secret thrill. We don't just fear the government, we secretly envy its supposed ability to break the rules of reality itself. Psychologists call this pattern conspiracy as coping. When trust erodes, the mind fills the void with narratives that restore a sense of order, even if that order is sinister. The time child myth is textbook. It takes documented government overreach, mixes it with a real but mundane meditation study, and seasons it with the timeless human hunger for the impossible. We want to believe that somewhere, in a sealed bunker beneath the hills of Central Virginia, a child once stared into the river and changed the course of a plane. Because if he could do that, then maybe, just maybe, the universe is more malleable than the daily news lets on. Maybe we are not merely passengers on the river. Maybe we can steer. And yet the evidence is as cold and clear as the concrete floor of that non-existent bunker. No Elias Reed ever lived the life the legend described. No Dr. Harlan Voss ever signed a termination order. No 17-minute blackout ever swallowed a CIA facility in 1983. The physics that would have been required still mocks the idea from every equation. The paper trail, hundreds of thousands of declassified pages from Stargate, Gateway, and MKUltra, contains nothing but the quiet admission that the agency chased ghosts and came back mostly empty-handed. The boy, the bleed-throughs, the erasure trucks in the night, all of it was written later, by us, because the silence left by real but limited government programs was simply too loud to bear. The CIA did not erase the time child. We invented him to explain why the world sometimes feels so cruelly ordinary. That is the final, quiet truth the river carries. Not that time can be bent by an 8-year-old in a soundproof room, but that the human imagination will always reach for the extraordinary when the ordinary feels insufficient. We build myths not because we are gullible, but because we are hopeful. We want the universe to be bigger than the files. We want the possibility that somewhere, someone once changed a small thing and saved a plane full of strangers. And maybe that hope is not entirely misplaced. Because while no time child ever walked out of a Central Virginia bunker, the real lesson of 1983 remains. The mind is far more powerful than we let ourselves believe on ordinary days. Meditation, focus, altered states, they do shift perception. They do open doors inside the brain that feel, for a moment, like doors in time. Science has since confirmed what the Gateway report only guessed at: neuroplasticity, the default mode network, the way theta waves can dissolve the rigid boundaries of self and clock. We cannot pull yesterday's newspaper into today. But we can change how we remember yesterday, how we meet tomorrow, and how we act in the single, stubborn present we actually have. So the next time you hear a story that sounds too perfect, too terrifying, too full of erased files and vanished children, pause. Ask where the river really flows. Ask what gap in your own trust or wonder the tale is trying to fill. And then ask the one small question the legend still leaves behind. The question that no debunk can quite erase. If the mind really can touch the edges of time, what might you change, if only for a moment, if only in the quiet chamber of your own thoughts? The river keeps moving. But now you know the current.